Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Stephen C. Smith, author of Hitchcock and Herrmann, The Friendship and Film Scores That Changed Cinema. Before we proceed, a little story. Back in 2011, I proposed to the Wall Street Journal a story on the centennial of the birth of Bernard Herrmann. Securing the assignment, I traveled to the University of Southern California in Santa Barbara to examine their Herrmann archives that includes almost all of his film scores, all written in Herrmann's own hand. I assumed an archivist would stay with me and help me see how Herrmann composed and orchestrated his great works. But the archivist left me alone among pages and pages of scores. I was lost. I come to music via rock and folk. My sight reading is limited to top-line melodies and maybe the bass line. Herrmann wrote for a full orchestra or unusual combination of instruments. In one score, I recall, there were parts for 7 organs to be played simultaneously. To help me understand what I had seen, I made 2 phone calls. One to John Williams, the composer-conductor who earlier in his career played piano on Herrmann's sessions. The other was to Stephen C. Smith, today's guest, and author of A Heart at Fire's Center, The Life and Music of Bernard Herrmann, an extraordinary biography I had read years earlier. Stephen was very patient when he explained to me what Herrmann had achieved with his masterworks. For his first Herrmann book, Stephen C. Smith received the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. Variety said that Herrmann book was responsible for, quote, a huge uptick of interest in that once neglected, now practically deified film composer. Stephen also produced some 200 documentaries about film and music and is a 4-time Emmy nominee. I haven't spoken to him in years, so I'm very happy to say, Stephen C. Smith, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Stephen, before we delve into your new Hitchcock and Herrmann, you mentioned that we hear Herrmann's music these days in the most unexpected places in popular culture. Can you cite some examples?
Absolutely. I realized it was time to write my second book on Hitchcock and Herrmann when I was hearing the Vertigo main title in the first 2.5 minutes of Lady Gaga's Born This Way video, when I heard the score that Hitchcock threw out on their last would-be collaboration, Torn Curtain, when I heard that score in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, when I was hearing it on ringtones, TV commercials, parodies. I mean, it's interesting. I wrote, to date, the only Herrmann biography back in, well, it was published in 1991, begun in 1984. And back in those days, I had to tell people in the industry often who he was. And now he, as my Google alert tells me every day, he is ubiquitous in world culture. There are literally millions and millions of Google entries on the Psycho music, the shower music, and there are hundreds of thousands of entries on just some of the chords he uses in Vertigo. So it's amazing. Francois Truffaut asked Benny, as friends called him Benny, asked him to score his film Fahrenheit 451 in the 60s. And Benny, who could be contentious, said, well, why do you want me? You know all these avant-garde composers. And Truffaut said, well, they will give me the music of the 20th century. You will give me the music of the 21st. And as I say in my book, time has proven Truffaut right. Bernard Herrmann is the sound of our anxious times in the 21st century.
So those who don't know Herrmann know Herrmann.
Yes, even if you don't know it. If you've seen Psycho, Vertigo, North by Northwest, watch some Twilight Zone or Alfred Hitchcock episodes, I could go on and on. Yes.
Yes. So on to Hitchcock and Herrmann. When did you start thinking about it?
Well, this particular book, I say this was 40 years in the making. I'll keep this brief. Back in 1983, I was a 19-year-old new college student with no clue what to do with my life. I loved music and played music and studied it for years, loved movies. My brother was a Broadway actor. And so I was being pulled in this movies and music direction. And while I was trying to figure life out, I mentioned to my brother over the Thanksgiving dinner table that there was no book on this man, Bernard Herrmann. And besides the incredible films he worked on, from Citizen Kane, his first, to Taxi Driver, to his last, by way of Hitchcock, and the remarkable personality he had, surely someone should have written a book on him. And my brother said the words that changed my life. He said, "Well, why don't you write one?" And I thought, well, it'd be fun certainly to meet and interview people. I could collect some interviews perhaps. And that led to an 8-year odyssey that gave me a career. It really gave me my life. It pushed me in the direction of broadcast journalism. And ever since then, I've been primarily making documentaries on film. But every few years, I write a book. And to date, all 3 of those have been about film music. The reason I returned to Herrmann for this new book called Hitchcock and Herrmann was because I was in my 20s when I wrote that book, and the decade was the 1980s. There was no internet. There were, so many papers had yet to be found, and I certainly found enough, I think, for the original biography. It's still in print, and I'm happy it turned out well according to others. But I always thought, boy, there's so much more material now. I've heard the recording sessions. I heard the recording session of Benny moments before he was fired by Hitchcock. It's there. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to really focus in, as many biographers are doing, and even some film biographies are doing? Wouldn't it be fun to focus in and be in the room with Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann during arguably Hitchcock's greatest period of the mid-50s to the mid-60s, which encompasses Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, The Birds, and many others, and first go on the set with Hitchcock and see what doesn't work. For all of his famous planning, we all know that we can make plans every day of our lives, and things are not always going to go according to plan, and that's where Herrmann's music could come in. And this wasn't just a case of a director hiring a good composer. This was a case of a filmmaker who, after 30 years as a director, had never really found the musical voice for his films. And when he heard the first score that Herrmann wrote for him for a movie called The Trouble with Harry, Hitchcock realized at the recording session he had found the missing piece for his films. And he was, not only does he hire Herrmann to score his next film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, he puts Herrmann on camera as himself, as the conductor in the Albert Hall would-be assassination sequence. So that's really committing to someone. You can't throw out the music as easily. And fortunately, Hitchcock didn't want to. And by their 4th collaboration, I'm counting here, yes, their 4th, Vertigo, Hitchcock is actually consulting with Herrmann about the editing of scenes and planning them with the music. And there is an entire, what they used to call a reel of film, about 13 minutes of Jimmy Stewart following Kim Novak's character. And other than a few words here and there, it is silent. And that is because Hitchcock had so much faith in the genius that Herrmann had of turning human psychology, human passion into music, that he could literally tell us what the characters were thinking and feeling in a way that I would say no other composer in the 20th century in any medium has done as well.
You tell us that Hitchcock was aware of Herrmann via his score for Citizen Kane and his work for CBS Radio. You tell us that they ran into each other at the Brown Derby, and Hitchcock suggested they work together. Now, at that time, Hitchcock was in his mid-50s, Herrmann a decade younger. What do you think made their early relationship so successful? By early, I mean the Trouble with Harry period.
Sure. Well, by the time that they finally worked together, and let's just say in 1955, since the contracts were signed at the very end of 54, by that time, Hitchcock had so many frustrating experiences with the completion of his films. He was brought to America by the famous and brilliant producer David O. Selznick. But Selznick was a notorious micromanager, and the notion of having a director have a strong voice in the scoring of the film just didn't, that was anathema to Selznick, who saw himself as the primary creator of the film. Now, we have to give Selznick a lot of credit because he's the one who brought Hitchcock, after about a decade of success in Britain, having films released internationally, Selznick recognizing Hitchcock's genius and making his Hollywood career possible. But Hitchcock was so frustrated to have ideas about the sound design and the music, which were so important to him, only to have Selznick do something very different. And Hitchcock's goal, like many a filmmaker, I'm thinking of writers turned directors like Billy Wilder and Preston Sturges, or who also became producers. Hitchcock decided that one day he would have control of things. And that really happened in the mid 50s. And that's where my book begins, with Alma and Hitchcock celebrating this incredible success of a deal that Hitchcock's agent, Lew Wasserman, remember that name? Lew Wasserman had arranged that essentially gave Hitchcock creative control at Paramount and an enormous amount of money. I mean, he would own some of the films, he would get money off the gross take. This was extraordinary. And I think that it was that deal that so invigorated Hitchcock that we get films like Rear Window, which was just before Benny joined him, and then the great series of films he did with Herrmann. So he really knew what he wanted to have, and Benny gave it to him.
So what do you think that they had in common? I mean, Hitchcock's wife, Alma, who you just mentioned, she called it mutual pigheadedness.
Mutual pigheadedness, yes. Yes, there's a wonderful play called Benny and Hitch written about them. And that, yeah, I'm so happy that Alma and Lucy, Benny's wife, are characters in that.
Yeah. Now, I think you parceled out beautifully their emotional quirks, the mutual emotional quirks. Yeah, you point out that they were both insecure. They had a strong revulsion to injustice. They could be obsessively romantic. Anything else they had in common?
I think you have ticked off the top ones on the list, Jim. And it's funny. I was listening to an interview that you gave where you were being asked questions, and there was discussion about how at the heart of every good story there's a crime, which reminded me, was it Balzac who said, "Behind every great fortune there's a crime"? And I thought, is there a crime behind my book? And I thought, well, there sort of is, because Hitchcock would tell this story endlessly, and we'll never know if it was true, about how when he was 5 or 6, he had committed some minor childish infraction, and his father, in this kind of strict Catholic family, walked him to the local constabulary and had little Alf put in a jail cell, for 5 minutes. And then he was told, "This is what we do to naughty boys." And if that happened, if it didn't happen, something like that happened, because I began interviewing Hitchcock's colleagues, coworkers, friends in the 1980s for my original book, and they all attested to the fact that when a policeman pulled up near the car, even if he was just a passenger, he would sweat, he couldn't speak, which does open up the question: is there a bigger story here that we may never know? I don't know. So
Yeah.
Hitchcock was fascinated by how all of us feel guilty, whether over something. And meanwhile, Herrmann. Herrmann was, and I use this word not lightly, I really do think that Herrmann was a genius in that he could absorb literature, music, art in his teens and remember it, and be able to give lecture quality discussions of it in his 20s. As soon as he was getting jobs as a professional composer for the first time, he just had this remarkable intellect, and that intellect was inside a body that was often braying with a harsh New York accent and intense emotion, and which was rather charming in his 20s and 30s. It grew less so as he became older, but Herrmann was, I think, fascinated by and ultimately obsessed with the notion that artists were treated badly. And certainly in Hollywood, we all know that composers are low on the totem pole, and are low on the list of people with a say, which happily was not true in his career, mostly thanks to various people that did give him a great deal of say. But I think that Herrmann was, as you say, fascinated by this notion of justice and injustice. And so when you get to a film like Hitchcock's The Wrong Man, a true story in which Henry Fonda plays a musician who is wrongly arrested for crimes he did not commit, and for a time incarcerated, and it really destroyed this man's life. That is exactly the kind of subject where Hitchcock and Herrmann could find, as they did so often, a real melding of sensibilities that is almost unique in cinema.
Yeah. Now, these mutual emotional quirks, you as a writer, you have the challenge to illustrate these emotions, and to illustrate how they may have affected the work.
Yes, that was another reason I wanted to write the book, because I'm now 60 years old. I was 20, 21 when I was interviewing many of the people for the first one. I hope, well, I know I have 40 years of life experience and hopefully have learned things over those years. And over the years, I began to think about these men. And I confess that, Hitchcock was, particularly in the 1980s, villainized, demonized. One biography in particular depicted him as just pretty much a nonstop sadist. I subsequently learned that a great deal of information in that, or a great deal of what is written in that book, was not true. And I'm not saying Hitchcock was a saint, but he was a complicated person, as was Benny. But I must say that as I began to be a director and producer myself and working with composers, and if I had a tight deadline for something airing on a network and the music wasn't what we were all expecting, it was a deeply frustrating experience. And that was ultimately what happened to Hitchcock and Herrmann. So when I reached what has become one of the most famous aspects of their story, their very bitter break in 1966, I devote 2 chapters to what I kind of think of as the slowest motion car crash you can imagine over many years. But I tried to tell it from the point of view of where no one is a villain, as Jean Renoir says in Rules of the Game. Everyone has their reasons. And so I tried to tell it from Hitchcock's point of view, where he has had a flop film. He thinks the current one isn't good. He's counting on Benny to save him. Benny is looking at the situation, thinking that Hitchcock is listening to the wrong people, and privately he is going to ignore what Hitchcock has asked him to do and do something different. And also look at the studio and see how they thought that they were trying to protect and help one of their greatest assets, Alfred Hitchcock, by bringing him into more pop sensibility that we had in the mid '60s, in an era of John Barry, Henry Mancini, and the Beatles. And so no one was trying to have this be a disaster, but it was, and I think it was
right.
It's something that pained Herrmann for the rest of his life, because for him it was as much a friendship and a chance to work with someone he had deeply admired long before, 20 years before they met. Benny took his first wife, Lucille Fletcher, to see the 39 Steps, one of Hitchcock's great British films, back in 1935. So anyway, so yes, they're all people, and I think their humanity kept speaking to me over the years as I grew older, and I wanted to perhaps show a richer version of them all in a form that is not novelistic. But to borrow a phrase from the writer Eric Larson, who I like very much, he calls his book narrative nonfiction. And every quote has an end note, and everything is there's no supposition in here apart from what a biographer is usually allowed to do. But I did want it to have the energy of, let's say, the kind of things that you do so well, Jim, and I marvel at, which is to write fiction, but keeping it rigorously factual.
Yeah. Now, Stephen C. Smith, the writer, I have to say that I thought you walked the tightrope very well in your balanced presentation of both men. But I think we have to acknowledge that both, and particularly Herrmann, could succumb to their own worst instincts.
Absolutely.
And Stephen, as you know, many people in Hollywood and in the concert world considered Herrmann a bad guy, but I sense that you don't seem to.
Oh, I don't think he was a bad guy at all, and even the people who were hurt by him, whose friendships ended during his lifetime. When I interviewed them in the 1980s, and then sometimes re-interviewed them for the new book, if I was lucky, and they were still with us, to a person almost, they spoke of him with great affection as someone who could be, and that's what I tried to show in my book by contrasting 2 different dinner party nights.
I can't. I was just about to mention that, Stephen. I thought that was an ingenious way to present to the reader what could have happened.
Good. And with each, almost every chapter is one of their films, but I tried to think of a theme that surrounded that film that could be the theme of that chapter. And that's at the beginning of the chapter on North by Northwest. And just a sign of Benny's good instincts and erudition, he had a screenwriter friend named Ernest Lehman, who wrote Sabrina, Sweet Smell of Success, adapted The King and I, would later adapt West Side Story and many others. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Benny said, I think you would get along with Hitch. And the result was Lehman and Hitchcock making North by Northwest, which Benny scored. And at the beginning of that chapter, yes, I do a composite of what a very good night would be like with Benny and his wife, Lucy, at their home. And Herrmann could be the most delightful host. And I've heard many conversations, or many interviews with him, and early recordings that people don't know as well when he was on the radio. And his knowledge was deep, but he wore it lightly and was a tremendous conversationalist and a great listener. So there was that wonderful side, but there was also a great insecurity. And for reasons that yet perhaps I wrote the second book to continue to try to explore and understand, there was an element of self-destruction in him. There was certainly a suspicion, a distrust that someone he was being drawn to might hurt him. And therefore he struck out first. And then the result was inevitably unhappy. And some nights with the Herrmanns were just absolutely horrible, with people walking out and him just being in a tirade, usually over the fact that younger and more charismatic conductors, like in particular Leonard Bernstein, were getting the jobs that he hoped to have. And this is another sort of tragic irony that it is in fiction and fact, is that he has everything except the thing that he wants the most, which is to be a respected conductor of concert music. He did not look down on film music. He wasn't one of those people who said, I'll do this until I really can prove that, I'm the greatest concert composer and conductor of all time. Absolutely not. He loved writing for different media, but he also loved music of all eras, going back to Tudor music, to the music that was written that morning in his own time. And when he worked with a sympathetic orchestra, as he did for 15 or so years with the CBS Symphony, he did marvelous concerts. They're really terrific because the musicians understood him. They understood his deficiencies and they responded to his strengths. Unfortunately, when he went out into the world, he did not behave like Leonard Bernstein, who was so charming and talented. Benny would almost go out of his way to insult people that you just shouldn't insult. And naturally, his career suffered, floundered, and virtually ended in terms of him having a concert conducting career. And I think that in an interesting way, you could make the case that his deepening, for want of a better word, sourness, let's say his darkening view of the world, found its perfect outlet in Hitchcock's darkening view of the world in films. So you start with a romantic dark comedy like The Trouble with Harry, and in 5 years you're making Psycho, and movies don't get more bleak and nihilistic than that.
Right. For the sake of our listeners, what you do that I thought was very creative was you side by side what a pleasant evening with the Herrmanns would have been like, and what a catastrophic evening with the Herrmanns would have been like.
Yes.
And I found that a very, very interesting technique. I mean, ultimately, we have to separate the artist from the art, right?
Yes, we do. It's just it can be difficult. It's funny. I don't know about you, Jim, but there are people. The more we know about them, sometimes it's hard for me to not have things in my mind about them. And other people I can forgive completely when I enjoy their work. It's totally irrational, and Herrmann certainly understood irrationality in his music, as did Hitchcock.
Yeah, I want to go back to the way you organized this story, which I thought was. Um, you made it very easy for the reader, which I think is essential. You take us from film to film with ample information about what happened in between. What I found is that the story unfolded so smoothly that it seemed inevitable to have done it that way. Did you always have it in mind that you would go from film to film in chronological order?
I did have in mind, and by the way, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that. It does move chronologically forward, but I also wanted from the very beginning to do something different from the more traditionally written or organized biography on Herrmann that I wrote decades ago. I wanted this book to start in 1954 when they are on the eve of collaborating, and they're both very successful men in their own right. And yes, we're moving forward, but then at what I felt were appropriate times, you get narrative flashbacks, if you will, relevant ones that give you the information you need about their lives that took them to that point. So you know who these men are, but always trying to do it so it comes very much intrinsically out of the contemporary situation. And then the great fun of the book, and maybe an area where our writing, I think, comes closest to intersecting with your long coverage of popular music, is the amazing fact that in the years that followed the Hitchcock-Herrmann collaborations, which were mostly ignored, musically speaking, by the public and by critics, in the years since, everyone from the Beatles to, as I mentioned, Lady Gaga, Atticus Ross, Danny Elfman became a film composer basically because of his love of Herrmann. There's this tremendous influence on composers, but then there's an influence on filmmakers. And I don't just mean the Hitchcock aspect, the Hitchcock-Herrmann of it all. It influences artists, visual artists. And that's what I found really fun. So whenever there's a particular piece of music from the films that are talked about, for example, when the love music from Vertigo, the climax of the film, is frankly, for no particularly good reason, lifted entirely and placed in the movie The Artist, that silent film that won Best Picture, when the director threw out his composer's music and put in 5.5 minutes of Bernard Herrmann. It just shows how tremendous the influence is of the music today. I mean, Stephen Sondheim wrote Herrmann a fan letter when Sondheim was 15 years old and got a reply from Benny. Again, I always do try to stick up for Benny when I can. And especially in the later years of his life, and I quote him, and I did get to interview him twice, he talked about what an influence Herrmann had been on him. And he said that Sweeney Todd was his homage to Bernard Herrmann, and that is built on what he called a Bernard Herrmann chord. So the reach of the music is fascinating, and that's something that really wasn't there on the first book, and is a great fun to discuss. I also thought it would be great for to try to make the book cinematic, and by having these interpolations of our times, or the Beatles making Revolver and listening to the arrangement of the Psycho main title, to have the string arrangement for Eleanor Rigby, to have these moments, you can jump into the future, you can jump into the past. And there's an interesting relationship between Herrmann's first two wives that is told chronologically in my original biography. But when I got to Vertigo, which is the story of two women, I thought, wait, maybe I can hold this as a bit of a secret, and then it can come logically out of the discussion of Vertigo. And so that's how I approached it. I tried to do it in a way that was never gimmicky, but in a way that kept the reader engaged, because you were going to be traveling through time with these men, and then ultimately going back into what I hope feels like a very intimate space with them, and eavesdropping on the discussions of these great minds.
Right. So by moving from film to film, you show us how Herrmann grew as a composer, but you also encourage us to re-examine the films with an ear toward the score. You mentioned The Wrong Man a few minutes ago. I'm thinking of The Wrong Man.
Yes.
On a casual viewing, the music is understated, much as the film itself is.
Mm-hmm.
Let's listen to one cue from Herrmann's The Wrong Man score. Here, Henry Fonda playing a Manny Ballestero, the titular Wrong Man, is walking toward a prison cell. Stephen, what stands out for you in that piece?
Well, it stands out how Herrmann's approach to music was to film music was different from many of his contemporaries. He often described film as a mosaic, and he said that there were times where the music really wasn't to be noticed. It was to be very, very subtle, but that if it weren't there, it would make a tremendous difference in the film. And of all the Hitchcock Herrmann films, I think that's most true in The Wrong Man, because it's not, for good reason. It's not a score that's recorded separately. He writes this very subtle music for muted brass and woodwinds and a solo bass, which is the instrument that Fonda's character Manny plays, the solo bass. And he creates this eerie Kafkaesque kind of nightscape terror. And I should say that one thing that worried Hitchcock's producer on the film, co-producer Herbert Coleman, was how passive Henry Fonda is throughout this experience of being arrested and charged. But I think for Hitchcock, that was part of what was so striking. And I think it still makes the film powerful, is this kind of sense of being paralyzed by the fact that you cannot believe you're going through this situation, you know. And so what Herrmann does in that music, well, by using the solo bass, clearly he's referencing Manny, but it's almost like it's a doppelganger version of Manny. And Hitchcock loved his doubles. There are doubles in almost all of his films. So it's almost like this isn't in my book, but you could say, well, is that the person who did commit the crime? Is Manny feeling guilt of other aspects of his life? Why is this solo bass that he plays now sounding so sinister with him? And by muting the brass, and Herrmann, boy, he was specific about which mutes he used: cup mutes, hard mutes. The sound of the music was important as the notes that he chose. So he creates this very cold sound of the slow movement. And then at the end of the film, when Manny is finally exonerated, it's the only time in the movie, the very last chord of the film, there is this big fortissimo statement by the brass, and they are unmuted. And of course, no one in the audience outside of a few musicians recognize that, but subliminally, it's a very different sound. So that's the way he thought about films. I mean, really, on almost all of his movies, you can say he had a clever intellectual approach, but it's also totally instinctive. I take him at his word when he said that he could usually walk out of a rough cut screening where there was no music and pretty much know what he wanted to do with the music in his head and hear some of the themes.
Yeah. At the end of that, that little snippet we heard, that you get that sort of Herrmann dark orchestral growl.
Yes.
That foreshadows Psycho 4 years later. But in between comes Vertigo and North by Northwest, both with rich orchestral scores. And, as you point out, both Hitchcock and Herrmann moved effortlessly in and out of technicolor spectacle, and then from the intimate to the grand.
Yes.
And odd that they could personally be so insecure, yet take on such artistic risk.
Absolutely. I think while Herrmann might have had insecurities and certainly the word that comes to mind to him is an oversensitivity to everything. I mean, on the plus side, his sensitivity to people, to emotions, to feeling, obviously that served him brilliantly in his work. His oversensitivity and feeling that someone's comment was intended as an insult when it wasn't, that was the unfortunate side of him. He was very confident in his work, with very few exceptions. And I think that was something Hitchcock really appreciated, was that Benny felt so strongly. I remember Buck Houghton, one of the producers of Twilight Zone, said, Benny saw every project as a cripple, and he would walk in and say, don't worry, I'll fix it. And many a director looks at their movie without music and thinks, God, that scene didn't work. So they were usually happy when Herrmann said that, and invariably happy with the result, with Psycho being perhaps the ultimate case in the Hitchcock-Herrmann canon of music really, changing the fate of a movie as well as its content.
Is it safe to say, though, that Psycho was the beginning of the end of Herrmann and Hitchcock's collaboration?
Well, it's the greatest triumph. So, when you hit the peak, I think everything is inevitably going downhill from there. I will say, and if you don't mind my saying briefly, that Hitchcock, after spending what was then a mammoth $4.2 million on North by Northwest, a very expensive movie for its time, with a lot of locations and travel and big stars, Hitchcock decided, looking at all these cheap Roger Corman drive-in movies that were being made for less than $1 million, he thought, what if I made a movie for less than $1 million and chose the most sensationalistic material I could find that I can get past the censors, but make it as good as possible? And what would happen? And so when he really didn't have to, at age 60, Hitchcock took, I think, the risk that made the riskiest move of his career by optioning a book that Paramount hated, Psycho by Robert Bloch, which their studio reader called repulsive. He made it for just over $800,000, which was nothing then. That's like 3 TV episodes. And he was smart enough, though, to retain his editor from his feature films and his composer, Bernard Herrmann. And I have it from 3 different sources that when Hitchcock looked at the rough cut, which was about half hour longer than the final film, but with no music, he thought, my God, they're right. It doesn't work. This doesn't work. And according to Benny, and there's a version of this in Hitchcock's authorized biography as well, according to Benny, Hitchcock said, I'm thinking of cutting this down for television. And Herrmann said, you don't know what you have, and I have an idea. And Herrmann's idea, broadly speaking, was, as he later put it, to create a black and white sound to match the black and white photography. And he wrote what is, and please someone tell me if I'm wrong, I've been looking for 40 years, he wrote the first score for a major Hollywood film entirely for a large string orchestra. And he created, of course, as we know, think of the shower scene, but the main title of Psycho. But every cue in that movie does something. And it's so powerful that when Hitchcock heard that music with the film, he knew he had a different movie. And privately, he would tell people, something he didn't normally do about his collaborators, how greatly Herrmann had contributed to the project. Well, I think that when Benny had that success, especially since Hitchcock had told him not to write music for the murder scenes, and Benny thought, well, no harm, no foul. He doesn't have to use the music, but I have an idea for those. And he wrote, of course, the famous screeching strings that travel down from the violins down into the low double basses. Well, when Hitchcock heard that music, he said, of course, we'll use that. And it's arguably the most famous film music cue of all time. I think that when Benny had that success, when 5 years later, Hitchcock was down, not doing well critically, and urged Benny to write a much more commercial pop kind of score, which, let's face it, was not the thing you asked Bernard Herrmann to do. You should just get someone else to do it. But Benny kind of said yes, 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 and paid him lip service. And then he wrote, surprise, a Bernard Herrmann score. And so I think that you could argue that that does stem from Psycho, because Benny thought, well, he saw what was right when he heard it, and I'm going to do that again. Unfortunately,
yeah, I think what I was referring to, and and you handled this really really well. You don't belabor this point, but Herrmann was indiscreet. He made public um, the disagreements that he had about the shower scene,
yeah.
and you point out that he did help shape the films to a certain degree. But do you think maybe he oversold his role in that?
I don't think he oversold his role, but I think he made a terrible mistake and this is where his ego comes into view. He was egoless when writing music for the film. If they threw out a cue of his, or he'd say, "Okay, I understand." He named the collaborators he worked with more than any other composer I know, going down lists of composers and cinematographers and other people who worked on the films and their contribution. But yes, his ego got the better of him with Hitchcock. And during their collaboration, he on a network television, no less, that Hitchcock had set up for him, he told the story of how Hitchcock didn't want music for the shower scene or the other murder. And he admitted he was wrong when he heard Herrmann's music. Well, if that was John Williams and Steven Spielberg would tell that story and laugh at himself and say, it just shows what a great composer John Williams is. Hitchcock wasn't like that. Hitchcock, for all sorts of reasons, it was important to him that his films be seen as an Alfred Hitchcock film. He was a persona. His television series had made him a household figure. They knew the voice, they knew the face, they knew all of that. And when they went to his films, he wanted them branded as his films. So yes, I think that when Benny started saying, "Hey, I was important to this too," I think that irked Hitchcock. I'm sure.
I think you point out something I did not know, that Hitchcock had almost a Sicilian approach to cutting off friendships. When he was finished with somebody, that was it.
Yes, yes. Norman Lloyd, the man who falls off the Statue of Liberty and later would be the co-producer of Hitchcock's TV series, and who lived to be, I think, 106 or 7 and left us just a couple of years ago. He was one of the great. He knew both. He was close friends with both men, so I was fortunate to know him. And he put it in an interesting way. He said that when Hitchcock felt that you were no longer on his wavelength, you stopped really existing for him. And I think the fact that he and Benny had been so almost telepathically connected for so long that when Herrmann became more obstreperous as tastes changed in films and he was getting fewer offers from others, and as Hitchcock's sense of, let's say, ownership of the work grew, his desire for that. Yeah, I think unfortunately it resulted in that breakup.
I have to tell you something. A few years ago, I attended an event in which the New York Philharmonic played the Herrmann score to a screening of Psycho.
Hmm.
You've heard about these things.
Oh, yeah, I've been to one or two.
Oh, okay, great. So there were people in the audience, and this probably happened at your event too, that had never seen Psycho. And when the shower scene came, they screamed.
Yes.
And when the Arbogast
Yeah.
murder screamed, and
Yeah.
when the big reveal in the basement came, I mean, they leapt out of their seats.
Isn't that a great feeling? And it's a reminder. And that's why when people I've seen introductions to Psycho that give everything away. And I say, there are people in the audience, hard to believe, who have not seen this. Yes, they had that. And I don't know if we have time, I'll tell it quickly, but when Psycho was finished, Hitchcock had changed from thinking this is a disaster to I cannot wait to show this. And everyone from Janet Leigh to her husband, Tony Curtis, to the head of Universal, Lou Wasserman, all went in for the cast and crew screening. And cast and crew screenings are not like screenings that audiences go to. Actors think, well, that wasn't my best take. Why did they use that take? And the crew members are thinking, God, this was a long day. We didn't get that right, did we? Well, when the music came on in Psycho, the room tensed up. And when the murder music came on, people jumped in the air. The people who were on the set were in the movie. And Hitchcock leaned over to someone who was watching his face and knew this whole backstory, and he smiled. And he should have smiled because he made, I'm sure, well over what we would now what would now be $100 million on that film.
I mean, and I have to say that you in the book described the reaction of the audiences back in 1960. It's genuine hysteria.
Fainting, hysteria. Absolutely. No one had seen a movie where, let's just say 47 minutes into it, something happens that had never happened in a movie before, completely unmooring the audience. And Herrmann walks this delicate balance. As Sondheim says, the genius of Herrmann is writing music that just gives you the feeling something's coming, something's coming, something's coming. And that's why I think those long Hitchcock movies with no dialogue, why those sequences work so well. The music is telling us, just wait. And for all of his famous use of repeated figures, he's never just repeating things like some composers would do. He's shifting the orchestration, the dynamics, the loud soft. And that's another reason I wrote this book, is I wanted to write for non-musicians to try to help them understand the brilliant techniques he used that had a psychological effect.
Well, I want to get to that point, Stephen. I have, first of all, I have to make mention of what I consider to be an invaluable part of the book, and that is the time and space you dedicate to the 17 episodes of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour that Herrmann scored.
Thank you.
You write, quote, his iconic brand of brooding menace would raise several episodes to the rank of classics. But what you do here, and I think this is one of the what became very clear to me, is how you used everyday language to communicate to us what Herrmann did and how he did it. It's not easy to write about music for a lay audience, is it?
I was going to ask you about that because that's something we obviously have in common is, yes, we have touchstone points in people knowing the bands or contemporary songwriters writing from personal experience. And in film music, we have images that we can reference. And we, in this case, have movies that people know. But how do you explain why this violin sounds different from that viola, in Psycho?
Right.
But there is a way to do it. I was determined to find a way to do it that someone with no musical background could do while also encouraging them to make it an interactive experience, because all of this music is online. You can spending a dime, you can hear these scores while reading the book.
Yeah, and you do it very well by simply using the right verbs and adjectives. I mean, I've got a section in front of me now where you mention a score both lush and astringent,
Mhm.
and you also say skipping chords on a vibraphone that sound like the mocking laugh of a deranged child. Now,
Yes.
I mean that anyone who can read can understand that.
Good. Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. There's nothing was harder in the book, as you know from your own experience, I'm guessing, but nothing was harder than trying to treat writing about music as if it's as dramatic as the life. And that's what I set out to do. So I'm glad that you felt it.
Yeah. No, the goal isn't to reinforce or articulate the sound of the music. As you point out, this music is readily available. Um, but what I think in this book, and one thing the book does very well, is you're often writing about music that even a devoted fan of Hitchcock may not have heard with an attentive ear.
Right.
Right? Okay, we know the shower scene. Okay, we know the opening of North by Northwest. Um, we know the love scene of Vertigo, but you carefully point out that there are scores of minutes of underappreciated music available to us.
Yes, that are gripping in their own right, and have found an audience around the world. It's amazing how how popular the music. And forgive me, I'm repeating myself, but yes.
I could go on for hours about this, Stephen, because I guess you can tell I love this book. But you revealed something that I'd wager most fans of the most famous rock band in history, the Beatles, may not have known. One, Bernard Herrmann was an early advocate for their music, and two,
Yes.
something you brushed upon earlier, that Herrmann influenced the Beatles' music. Could you elaborate on both, please?
Absolutely, and it's always nice when you have multiple sources, of course. And in 1961, Herman was conducting in northern England, and he was no snob about music. He really loved all kinds of music, even if his style is distinct. He conducted all sorts of music in his years on radio and in concerts. Well, he was in England and he heard the Beatles. This is during the Pete Best years. And he came back in 1961, and I had this from both Miklos Rocha and Norman Lloyd separately, that he called them late at night and said, "I have to play you this new music from England." And Rocha told me he thought it was going to be by Benjamin Britten or some British composer, concert composer of the time, and it was the Beatles. And Rocha was saying, "What is this noise?" And Herrmann was saying, "Listen to this modulation. This is brilliant." And Norman Lloyd listened to it, and I think Norman, being more diverse in his taste, he liked it. So I had them both remembering Herrmann coming back in 61 with the music. And Benny insisted that he took the music to Decca, which was a division of Universal MCA where Hitchcock was, and to CBS, where he was writing music for television. And they said, "Please don't bother us with this." So
Oh, no.
I find a deep irony in the fact that Herrmann would ultimately be thrown out of paradise, kicked out of Hollywood because he wasn't perceived as commercial enough when he brought the Beatles on a plate, to two places. And then briefly, Eleanor Rigby, their genius, producer George Martin, in listening to Eleanor Rigby, and Paul McCartney said that this was his idea as well. He wanted this string arrangement for Eleanor Rigby, and George Martin thought the Psycho main title. And I am so happy that we have what is it, 5 discs of Revolver and Revolver outtakes now, because you can hear the recording session of the string players for Revolver as they pull the sound back and pull it back until it is the no vibrato, very sharp, harsh Herrmann sound. And one of the musicians even says, "That's it, deadly." So
and Herrmann was open to electronic music.
yes, yes.
Yeah, and 3 years later, the Beatles do
Oh yeah,
"Tomorrow Never Knows," using
exactly.
a backwards looping technique that Herrmann had used.
Yes, he used that in Day the Earth Stood Still. And here's something for a playwright to tackle. Benny turned down a movie in 1967 called The Family Way, made by his friends. And he said, "You need a younger composer." Well, the producers hired Paul McCartney, and Paul McCartney went over to Benny's flat in London and got a film scoring lesson from Bernard Herrmann. And I just, boy, wouldn't you love to be in that room listening to
Oh boy.
people?
Yeah. Stephen, what's next for you? A new documentary, a new book?
Yes, I'm extremely fortunate in having three feature documentaries, all nearing completion at the moment. One is a companion piece to the book because I realized I wanted people to hear the music with this discussion as well. So hopefully the book and film will complement each other. I'm working on a feature about an aspect of Stanley Kubrick's career that has been left explored that I'm very, very excited about. And I'm working with Eddie Muller, the author, film
Eddie.
presentationist, and TCM host. Yes, are your friend and mine, Eddie Muller.
Yes. What a
And
great
a
man.
wonderful producer, Claire Lockhart, making a film about a great and very influential director, yes, who did some noir, Abraham Polonsky, and his fascinating life, which went from the early CIA to noir classics to being blacklisted to much more.
Wonderful. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Stephen C. Smith, author of Hitchcock and Herrmann, The Friendship and Film Scores That Changed Cinema, a book that will satisfy anyone who's loved the films of Alfred Hitchcock and the art of film scoring as done by the master, Bernard Herrmann. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you, Jim. It's been fun.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.